Boa noite, obrigada pela presença de vocês, bem-vindos à terceira mesa do Festival Poesia no Centro. Nossos olhos se ajustam à escuridão, com Tracy K. que conversa hoje com Adriana Ferreira Silva e Nanni Rios. Adriana Ferreira Silva é jornalista, escritora, curadora e pesquisadora de relações de gênero interseccionais na cultura e no jornalismo. Atuou como correspondente internacional em Paris e ocupou cargos no jornal Folha de São Paulo e nas revistas Marie Claire, Vogue e Veja São Paulo. É colunista do rádio CBN, do Nexo Jornal e colabora também nas revistas 451 e Número Brasil. Nanni Rios é jornalista, livreira, curadora e produtora cultural. É mestranda em letras na linha de pós-colonialismo e identidade no Instituto de Letras da Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul. Fundou a livraria Baleia, em Porto Alegre, e assina uma coluna de livros na revista de jornalismo independente matinal. Jornalismo independente matinal. A gente vai começar a conversa de hoje com uma exibição do filme do Daniel Brusson, de 2022. Daniel Brusson está presente. É um filme chamado My God, It's Full of Stars, e dura cerca de 5 minutos. É um filme que foi feito a partir de um poema da Tracy. A voz que narra é da Tracy. Agradecemos ao Daniel pela permissão da exibição aqui no festival. Obrigada e boa mesa.
From My God, It's Full of Stars. When my father worked on the Hubble telescope, he said they operated like surgeons, scrubbed and sheathed in papery green, the room a clean cold and bright white. He'd read Larry Niven at home and drink scotch on the rocks, his eyes exhausted and pink. These were the Reagan years, when we lived with our finger on the button and struggled to view our enemies as children. My father spent whole seasons bowing before the oracle eye, hungry for what it would find. His face lit up whenever anyone asked, and his arms would rise as if he were weightless, perfectly at ease in the never-ending night of space. On the ground, we tied postcards to balloons for peace. Prince Charles married Lady Di. Rock Hudson died. We learned new words for things. The decade changed. The first few pictures came back blurred, and I felt ashamed for all the cheerful engineers, my father and his tribe. The second time, the optics jibed. We saw to the edge of all there is. So brutal and alive, it seemed to comprehend us back.
Olá, boa noite a todas as pessoas aqui presentes. Primeiramente, a Nanni e eu gostaríamos de agradecer a presença de todo mundo que veio assistir a esse encontro, assim como o Festival Poesia no Centro, o Teatro Cultura Artística, as editoras Redicário e Malê e a Daniel Brusson, que permitiu que a exibição de My God, It's Full of Stars, esse filme que a gente acabou de assistir, partindo do poema da Tracy, narrado por ela, fosse exibido. Inclusive, o Daniel está aqui com a gente hoje na plateia. Mencionada por seus pares e pela crítica como voz definidora da poesia contemporânea estadunidense, Tracy K. carrega em seus versos e prosas a herança de sua ancestralidade numa comunhão que evoca amor, vida, morte e transcendência. Com uma obra que inclui 5 aclamados livros de poesia, além de memórias, ensaios e manifestos, Tracy ganhou o prêmio Pulitzer em 2012 com Vida em Marte, publicação que finalmente chega ao Brasil pela editora Relicário, com tradução da também poeta e jornalista Stephanie Borges.
Sua participação no Festival Poesia no Centro marca também o lançamento da coletânea Uma Fome Tão Afiada, Poemas Escolhidos, que é esse livro aqui, que, segundo Tracy, é um tratado, reunindo textos de toda a sua carreira, com seleção e tradução de Salgado Maranhão e Alexis Levitin, lançada pela editora Malê. É sobre essas 2 publicações, além de experiências que partem da poesia, para contornar as polarizações e pensar em um mundo melhor, que conversaremos essa noite. Eu queria pedir, então, uma salva de palmas para Tracy K. Smith.
Thank you so much. It's such a gift to be in the space of this poetry festival, which is already so full of light and insight and life force. And so I'm just so grateful to be here and to share this beautiful book, which I've just touched today for the first time. So I'll read one poem, and then I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I'm just going to use the volume I'm familiar with for now. But this is a poem called The Universe as Primal Scream. And I will just preface it by saying that I lived in New York City for many years in an apartment building with neighbors upstairs who had young children. And this was at a time before I had any children of my own. And so the noise they made seemed otherworldly to me and confusing. Now I have 3 children, and I want to apologize to those neighbors. But The Universe as Primal Scream. 5 p.m. on the nose. They open their mouths, and it rolls out, high, shrill, and metallic. First the boy, then his sister. Occasionally, they both let loose at once, and I think of putting on my shoes to go up and see whether it is merely an experiment their parents have been conducting upon the good crystal, which must surely lie shattered to dust on the floor. Maybe the mother is still proud of the 4 pink lungs she nursed to such might. Perhaps if they hit the magic decibel, the whole building will lift off and will ride to glory like Elijah. If this is it, if this is what their cries are cocked toward, let the sky pass from blue to red to molten gold to black. Let the heaven we inherit approach. Whether it is our dead in Old Testament robes, or a door opening onto the roiling infinity of space, whether it will bend down to greet us like a father, or swallow us like a furnace. I'm ready to meet what refuses to let us keep anything for long, what teases us with blessings, bends us with grief. Wizard, thief, the great wind rushing to knock our mirrors to the floor, to sweep our short lives clean. How mean our racket seems beside it. My stereo on shuffle, the neighbor chopping onions through a wall. All of it just a hiccup against what may never come for us. and the kids upstairs, still at it, screaming like the dawn of man, as if something they have no name for has begun to insist upon being born.
Antes de começar a nossa conversa, a gente vai fazer a nossa audiodescrição por questões de acessibilidade. Vou começar e depois vocês me seguem. Sou uma mulher branca, com cabelo curto, rosa um pouco desbotado, uma camisa estampada, uma calça escura, um sapato escuro.
Eu sou uma mulher negra, de pele clara, meu cabelo é crespo, grisalho, está preso num rabo de cavalo e eu estou usando um casaco branco, uma blusa e uma calça branca.
I'm a black woman with dreadlocks, and I'm wearing a black suit and some tennis shoes.
Thank you. A gente acabou de assistir, então, a uma belíssima animação sobre o seu poema My God, It's Full of Stars. E aí a gente já descobriu algo incrível sobre você, que é o fato do seu pai ter trabalhado no telescópio Hubble. Gostaria que você contasse um pouco mais sobre essa sua ligação ancestral com as estrelas.
Oh, sure. First of all, I want to say I can't listen to myself in 2 languages, so I'll take it off. The video, I couldn't turn around to see it, but I've seen it many times, and it's so exquisite. And I shared it with my family members, and they really, all of us felt like my father was present in that beautiful animation. So I want to thank the artist, and I'm excited to meet him after the presentation, hopefully. I think that my relationship to the stars, I want to say my ancestral relationship to the stars, it begins in spiritual terms. My family, my parents were people who were raised in Alabama in the 1930s and 40s during segregation. And they came from humble farming families, descended from enslavement. And they're evidence of the immense love, hope, care, and belief that runs through Black life, and that makes not only Black life possible, but I believe life possible. And to me, that feels like a cosmic inheritance. And a lot of the searching that I do in my work toward the souls of the people I love who are no longer here on Earth, toward our origins in history, in mythology, in the imaginations of other writers and thinkers, I think is a way of gathering up all of these vocabularies of power and of survival, and using them to keep going, which is what I think poetry also helps us to do. But when I was a child, when I was in elementary school, my father, who had previously served in the Air Force, the United States military for many years, retired from the service as an alternative to moving with my mother and me to Germany for another assignment while my 4 older siblings were in college in California. And so all of a sudden, he had to kind of make another livelihood. And he ended up taking a job as a contractor on some of the optical engineering that was happening in California for the massive national project that was the Hubble. And the only thing I really knew about what he did is what that poem says. You know, he would talk about this lens and the vision of the universe with such joy that it was contagious. That has been a part of my memory, but it got buried for a long time. And when I was writing the poems in Life on Mars, I was really thinking about America and my anxieties about the political world that we in every country, but especially in my country, contribute to. And then there came a moment when my father who passed away while I was working on those poems, I feel like he nudged me and said, hey, you're writing about space, you're writing about America, you're writing about, you're imagining what the universe is like. Do you remember I had this job where I was actually working on this device? And suddenly, I believe the book became a kind of collaboration with him. And not only the memories of that work that he did, but I don't know, I believe he offered me many different terms for thinking about the afterlife that he disappeared into for me. And so I think Life on Mars is a book that opened up a new portal into my understanding of myself as a poet and, our sense of existence here as humans on this planet, which is part of this other massive enterprise that used to feel so far away, the universe out there, but that I now am teaching myself to believe is present and near and here in this room with us. And that felt like a really wonderful gift.
Tracy, como você mencionou, Vida em Marte nasce dessa intersecção entre o luto, mas também da ficção científica, que é uma das referências do livro, do amor filial, do amor maternal, porque quando você escreveu esse livro, você estava grávida, vivendo a sua primeira gravidez. Como esses elementos expandiram suas questões sobre o universo, a morte, a eternidade e a poesia a partir desse livro?
I always feel that poems are kind of like thought laboratories, and I turn to them when I have unrest, when I have worry, when I have questions that don't seem to have answers. And initially, science fiction was a container that helped grab up all these sloppy feelings of worry and anger and resentment and need and hope and shape them into something that might lead me toward discovery or realization. And then grief became a major theme of my life. And form, there's an elegy in the book for my father called The Speed of Belief, and it's written over a number of sections, and each discrete section obeys a kind of poetic form. So there's a ghazal, there's a terza rima, and even sometimes just the constraint of regular stanzaic patterns helped me to hold it together, to say, okay, I'm awake today, I'm sitting at my desk, and I'm writing about my father because I need to draw him near to me, and I need to feel his life in my life. And so having to use a rhyming pattern meant that I knew that the next step I was taking had to sound a certain way. And all of those demands of form helped me to realize there were things I needed to say that were not merely the things you would wish to say about someone you love who's gone in an elegy. There's one section of the poem that uses the word, oh my gosh, I should look at it. I needed to rhyme with the word daughter. And I realized there was a moment in my life, like many children of parents, when I resented having to abide by my father's rules. I didn't want to be bound as anybody's daughter. And so the rhyme pattern nudged this memory into the foreground of my mind and made space for it in the poem. And that was a new form of release and honesty and claiming the complexity of my relationship with my father that felt monumental to me. And so writing this book, and I think writing poems in general, was a way of moving toward different versions of what needed to be acknowledged as truth, which is, I think, what poems offer in all of their different terms. They offer us the opportunity, the occasion, and the courage to move toward the most necessary and uncomfortable forms of truth that we need to bear witness to. And to be able to do that for my father while also doing that for my nation, it felt life-changing in a way. And of course, the miracle of life is that all of the clarity and resolution and all the answers that you arrive at, they stay true for like that long. And then suddenly you find yourself back in the mess of all these questions, which makes more poems necessary.
Eu vou passar para uma pergunta que talvez seja a que todo mundo pensa na hora que vê esse livro, Vida em Marte, que é sobre David Bowie, que aparece, né, de modo quase, digamos, místico, né, em alguns poemas. Eu queria que tu contasse para a gente quem é esse Bowie e o que ele diz sobre desejo, futuro, reinvenção.
I will start with an admission. Throughout the decade of my 30s, about once a year, I would have a dream in which I was hanging out with David Bowie. Oftentimes, we would be wearing matching jumpsuits, and we would be just hanging out in the studio or hanging out in the kitchen, and it felt like a date with destiny or something. And I know those dreams occurred because I felt liberated, as many people have, by his body of work. You know, his ability to name and claim all of the contradictions and all the beautiful possibilities that a single person can contain. And as I was just saying, like, a truth only stays true for a brief amount of time. His ability to transform himself and to say, okay, that's who I was at one point. I was Ziggy Stardust for a while, but now I'm the Slim White Duke, and soon I'll be someone else. I think it was another example of the many vocabularies that we as humans need, and that we're often swindled out of by a habit or custom or social pressure. I also believe maybe the language of the marketplace, and lately the language of technology, certainly the language of politics, try to make us smaller and consistent when that's not who we were made or created to be. And so Bowie is this wonderful, I guess I would think of him as a secular God figure in the book, a creator, or somebody who has the capacity to say, you too are a creator. So when I started thinking about the future, when I started thinking about science fiction, it felt important that there was space in the poems I might be writing or the book I might be writing for his vocabulary of the future, of reality, of the dangers that we humans create, and the capacity that we have to invent new realities. Those poems were written, and they coincided with poems in which I was surprised to find God appearing a lot. You know, God as a father figure, God as somebody a lot like the actor Charlton Heston, who appeared in so many of the science fiction and Bible movies that I watched growing up as a child. And also maybe the notion of a nation as a kind of parent that we also wrestle with and against. So those figures and forces felt like they were the different temperaments that I felt descended from in some ways.
Tracy, você costuma contar uma história de quando a poesia nasceu para você, o momento que a poesia nasceu para você, que foi quando você tinha entre 11 e 12 anos e leu pela primeira vez um poema da Emily Dickinson, nesse período, né, que é tão turbulento e emocionante no nosso início ali da adolescência. Eu queria saber que tipo de vocabulário ou de realidade você encontrou ali naqueles poemas da Emily Dickinson e como é que isso afetou a sua relação com o mundo a partir desse primeiro encontro com a poesia.
Yeah. I didn't know anything about Emily Dickinson when I first read a poem of hers, and it's that poem that begins, "I'm nobody, who are you? Are you nobody too?" But I felt startled into a different kind of encounter. I felt like there was this, I was a kid, and so the speaker felt youthful to me and mischievous. And what she was saying was, there's a version of yourself that you might know, but that you might have not been encouraged to embrace. And there's a world in which the values that would make some people somebodies and other people's nobodies are values that you have an opinion about, right? Suddenly the speaker's saying there's a pair of us, and we're essentially choosing a different value system. That felt really startling and surprising. It changed some of the terms that I had grown up with for me in a way that startled me as well. As a Black girl growing up in California in the 1970s and 80s, my parents instilled in me the opposite of what Emily Dickinson was saying. You are somebody, and your presence in every environment, although the people there may not announce it or believe it, is vital and valuable and unique and necessary. And I held that as true. But at the same time, I could also listen to the speaker of this poem saying, it means nothing to be somebody. Let's be nobody. And that contradiction, that conundrum also felt really inviting. I wanted to have the kind of wisdom that the speaker of that poem seemed to have. And I wanted to be able to laugh and defy the terms and the values of the people that sometimes made me feel excluded. So that was an initial nudge into a kind of perspective that language itself could offer. It was years later, that I really became invested in Dickinson's work. But again, there was something really inviting and familiar. She uses a lot of language that reminded me, and that sounds not accidentally like the language of the Old Testament. She's obsessed with the soul and with eternity. And I felt like there was a theology that was larger and stranger than much of what I had claimed, and that it came about by living in and listening differently to language. And I knew that somehow that felt like an important undertaking. I went for a long time not knowing there were living poets, not knowing that poetry remained a contemporary art form. But when I made that discovery, I realized that that's what I wanted to be. And the life of a poet, to me then, and I think still now, resembles the kind of joyful wisdom, defiance, and play of Dickinson, and also of childhood. And I feel very, very grateful that though there were a lot of people in my life, my parents included, who for a long time felt like poetry was an unsafe occupation, something in me remained stubborn or hopeful that poetry was actually a calling or a vocation that could make a difference.
Eu vou invocar, saindo da infância, agora pulando ali para um período pré-pandemia da sua vida, um projeto do qual você participou, que eu já li sobre, que é o Conversas Americanas, celebrando a poesia em comunidades rurais, que consistia basicamente em você viajar pelo interior dos Estados Unidos, lendo poesia em comunidades conservadoras, o que eu achei bem interessante, e queria que você contasse um pouquinho mais sobre esse projeto. Porque ele parece apontar para uma esperança, ou também não sei se seria um desejo meu, de uma pessoa que está vendo uma onda conservadora subir, né, cada vez mais, e tentando pensar jeitos de lidar com isso, de que essa espécie de escuta poética que você menciona, se isso seria capaz de tornar possível a convivência entre mundos aparentemente inconciliáveis.
I feel so grateful for that time period. It was 2017 to 2019. that I was traveling in rural America, reading and talking about the poetry of living American poets in communities that oftentimes were characterized by different political values than my own. And I wanted to do that because, as I saw it, that was a moment when our national vocabulary had broken, when suddenly it was permissible and encouraged and tolerated to be rude and disrespectful, volatile and untrue in the ways that people were being described. When debate shifted toward a kind of like insistent diatribe and the refusal to listen. And I think that's only accelerated and it's exacerbated now as we see it in many contexts in the unapologetic rhetoric of hatred that seems to be so rampant and so central to politics in America and elsewhere. I was watching the news, listening to this national vocabulary take root, but I was saying, I know that's not who we are. I know that if we were in a context where doubling down and defending our values and yelling, shouting each other back was not the prevailing mode, we could get somewhere. And meanwhile, I was teaching my poetry workshops with my students, and I loved the way that we'd be sitting together at a table, all of us poets and interested in poetry, but all of us different. And we would go reverent in the presence of a poem. And we would do everything possible to meet that poem where it was, to lean forward and grasp it, and then draw it toward our own lives, and to enter into a kind of relationship with a text, which is really another way of saying entering into a loving relationship with another imagination. The speaker of the poem, somehow that's attached to the poet, the author of the poem. And I would say, like, I know that if we could just use poetry instead of rhetoric, dogma, I think we could do something like that with other of our neighbors. And so the American Conversations Project made that kind of an experiment possible. And what I found was that I was right, that poetry is something that tempers our confidence and our arrogance, and that makes us needful of other people's expressions of experience and their questions, and grateful for the discoveries that they make by way of language and honesty. I was in spaces like drug rehab facilities, the kind of facility where somebody doesn't choose to go, but where they're mandated to go. And there was one of the first events that we did in Kentucky, in one of these places, and I was there with a team of professionals from the Library of Congress in America. I just want to say Dr. Carla Hayden, who appointed me, is a saint. She's someone who believes in the power of information, in the power of literature, and in community. And so I want to offer her my gratitude and my respect in this space. We were in that space one day, and someone who had white supremacist tattoos on his neck and face was in the room. And one of the staff members from the Library of Congress came up to me and said, okay, I spotted this. I know what this means. I don't know if you know what it means. Are you comfortable? We can shut this down right now. And I said, we're here to try this thing out. Let's try it out. And so we went forward, passed out these volumes of poetry, and that man had a response to a poem that was a love poem, a poem about love ending. And he said, I know this is a poem about love, but I'm here because of my relationship to substance abuse, to substance. And I gotta say that the feelings of heartbreak and longing in this poem remind me of that relationship that I'm trying to get out of right now. And he enlarged a poem that I had known for a long time. And he made himself and all of us vulnerable in a new way. And I think that's an act of love. And every time we went somewhere else, sometimes it was a community center, a couple times it was, a church kind of setting. But in every space, someone gave some part of themselves to the group of us to take in and corroborate in some way. And I know that isn't a capacity that has vanished. I know that we're still capable of that. And I think about that trip every day now with so much evidence to the contrary, but I also say I know given the circumstances and the encouragement and the atmosphere, like the atmosphere here at this festival, we can all love each other. We can all offer ourselves to one another in the most beautiful and generous way. And I think we need to remind ourselves of that. When people say, does poetry matter? Why have a poetry festival? What is the art form? Who's the audience? We need to say, poetry is one of the few things that is not driven by the economic market, by the terms of branding and corporate demands. And it's one thing that allows us to remember that we love the world and that we love one another, and that that's a prime function of being alive on Earth. And I feel like there's very little in the world that's more important than those things.
Tracy, além do Vida em Marte, o outro livro que está sendo publicado aqui no Brasil, Uma Fome Tão Afiada, é uma coletânea de textos seus, de todos os seus livros. Eu queria que você falasse um pouco sobre qual é o mapa afetivo, político ou existencial que esse livro traça, apresenta para os leitores.
I love that question. Thank you. First of all, when I was listening to the question, I was thinking, oh my gosh, I have twins in Brazil. These two books were born at the same time, and I'm the mother of twins, so that feels doubly exciting. When I think about Life on Mars, I know that is a book that is about being human on Earth, being a soul in the universe, and being somebody who is grounded in questions and conflicts that don't go away. And so there's something eternal about the kind of process we're here to master. But when I think about all of the books that I've written, and these poems come from them, and A Hunger So Honed, my first book is really a book of claiming a voice. I think first books are oftentimes a moment where the poet says, and I was able to do that at first by writing about other people's lives. And that emboldened me to think about the life I was in and the story or the stories of which it was made. And then the second book, which features some poems in A Hunger So Honed, is called Duende, and it's a book that was maybe one of the first moments when I began to think about America. It uses Lorca's concept of the duende, you know, the little demon or the creature that lives in us, challenging us to move past safety and decorum and knowledge and to struggle with the dark, large mystery that everybody contains. It's also a book that has to do with living in a culture that is marginalized by a larger culture. And so in some ways, I found the scope of my investment in community to grow from a family to a nation and even maybe to something global. Life on Mars is the book, you know, about the universe and the afterlife. And Wade in the Water, which followed that book, is about history and about the planet, our ecology, our imprint upon the space that we occupy right now. And the newest poems in that book, I think, are stretching toward a metaphysical citizenship, thinking about ancestors with whom I now understand I am and we are often or always in dialogue, especially in times of crisis, because they've experienced that and more and are still, I believe, at the helm of this project of liberation, which I think is at the heart of poetry and of survival. And so it's really a joy to be able to see these two books emerge sort of hand in hand, and also to have this little roadmap of where poetry has allowed me to wander, and to greet them here in a country that I have just a small relationship with over a brief span of time, but that feels so beautiful, vital, and I don't know, there's a kinship. I mean, the previous panel that we just attended with Miriam and Kuti and Osvaldo was just a magnificent expression of elders and their gifts to literature and humanity, and our relationship, even across borders, to shared roots, I wouldn't say raíces, shared roots and ancestry. And to be in Brazil, which is a country like mine, and which is incredibly diverse in every way, is to say the roots that we share are human roots. And we wrestle with them in many ways. We deny, we attempt to defy them, but there are moments when we can come together and bask in the beautiful things that they force us to acknowledge. And that just feels like such a blessing. So.
Eu vou seguir falando do livro Uma Fome Tão Afiada, que ele tem 2 poemas que eu queria pedir para tu comentar especialmente, que é Ministro da Saudade e Catedral Kitsch, que são inspirados em viagens tuas ao Brasil, especificamente Bahia, né, gente, que é um tipo de Brasil bem específico. Então, eu queria que você pudesse comentar para a gente um pouco sobre essa sua experiência na Bahia.
Bahia. A Bahia. I had plans to go to Bahia in late 2004. I made plans to take a solo trip to Bahia, and weeks before that trip took place, my first marriage fell apart, and so I was this like lonely, broken feeling person, and just kind of flying off into the world. And I felt like what I touched ground in was this family that said, you belong here. You know, we recognize you. And just to move through the streets and to encounter people and have conversations with strangers and to feel another expression of the history of enslavement, but survival and flourishing and defiance of so many attempted erasures. It made my little problem of a divorce feel like something that was just, you know, just a little ripple. And yeah, maybe at the end I'll read one of those poems. But to think about, you know, poetry is an act of translation, even when there's no language border that's being crossed, and it has to do with that notion of moving from one life toward another. Or even moving from one manifestation of yourself to another through language, and to realize I'm not what I thought I was. But to also begin to think about what happens when you are wrestling with those questions in a place where you get to cross a language and a cultural line or seeming border. Was also this really thrilling and exhilarating feeling of here's a doorway where new terms, tools, and magic can help you keep going. And that was just such a beautiful, beautiful thing. I think it happens every time you travel, if you let it.
Ainda falando sobre esse seu encontro com a diáspora africana aqui do Brasil, mas acho que não só, né, com a diáspora africana de outros países que você passou, eu queria saber como é que isso dialoga com a sua própria identidade, a sua linguagem de consciência racial e a busca por uma tradição literária da sua ancestralidade afro-americana.
I have these warm feelings that are on the surface of my mind, but I've also spent a lot of time looking for myself by going away from the obvious places where that discovery could happen. So I didn't grow up spending a lot of time in Alabama, where both of my parents came from. And during that first marriage, I would travel a lot to Mexico. My husband at that time was from Mexico. And there was a summer when I had a research project that allowed me to spend 3 months in Afro-Mexican communities in La Chica Costa, the small coast, like the southwest coast of Mexico. And there was a wonderful struggle of recognizing a kinship and wanting to claim and embrace it, and even, you know, being able through language to be legible to one another, and also these constant reminders that I was different. You're an American, or you're Afro-American. That's not what we are, and all of the, you know, surprises and the realizations and the consternations of the fact that it's not ever an actual and seamless mirroring that we can offer one another, even when there is much that we share. I think oftentimes recognizing our relation to one another is bittersweet, and I think that's really important. I think that's the fact of most things, is that there is a pang of grief that makes the recognition more poignant. And that means where we have business with one another, we also have work. We have work to do. And there are ways that work can happen that are willing and that are illuminating. I feel years later, and this is one of the reasons why writing is such a helpful undertaking. Years later, moments of clarity emerge that can lead me back to the page. So I probably, in fact, there are poems from that first marriage that are coming to me now that have to do with innocence and betrayal, you know, as an inevitable stages of life. I think we can think about those things in cultural terms as well. And I think we can also think about them as stages toward larger forms of clarity that move past what I'll describe as nostalgia, or a romantic sense of, oh, we found each other and we're whole. I think that the terms of resistance, survival, and defiance that emerged from the generation of senior Afro-Brazilian poets that we just were moved by earlier remind me that our work is willing struggle. Naming the truth shouldn't get easier. It gets harder. And the struggles that we embrace in every context of our lives makes that harder and harder work something that we're better and better equipped to do. So I don't know if I feel like I veered from some of the coherence of your question, but those are some of the things that come to mind.
Agora uma questão, digamos, mais política, e que não deixa de ser, então, uma questão pertinente num festival de poesia. O atual embate entre o governo de extrema-direita, do presidente Donald Trump, e as universidades. Isso interfere diretamente no seu trabalho como professora? Ou como isso interfere? E quais as formas de resistir dentro da universidade?
Well, yes, there is a direct effect that we can feel. There are many. One that is foregrounded for us in terms of the purpose of universities has to do with research and scholarship and academic freedom, and the threats against those things which have been monetized into funding really change the ease with which vital projects, and by that I mean projects vital to humanity, can take place. And fortunately, there is a real sense of creative intelligence that rises to the occasion to figure out how the large and essential mission of a university can continue, perhaps at a different scale, perhaps with greater constraints in areas other than the heart of the matter. But I think there's another thing that we're feeling, and I don't think that universities are the only spaces that are feeling that. There's this weight that many of us feel in terms of what form of honesty we are allowed to claim. Even just the moment, like the millisecond of time where you weigh whether or not you ought to say what you're thinking is an incredible kind of, I'm thinking of like what it feels like to be struck by something. It's a blow. And I believe that is an intentional hindrance that is actually a distraction from something bigger. Because as much as I feel, as somebody who spent most of my life at universities, like we're unique victims, we actually aren't, right? We witness violence, death, genocide, crimes against humanity happening in many nations, in many contexts, in many communities, and they're not new. But the fact that these pristine seeming institutions with extreme endowments that have equated to freedom are now suffering is something that makes us feel scared. And when you're scared and in the spotlight, what do? You shrink and you go quiet. And I think that's the larger purpose of these policies, to have us shrink and go quiet and imagine that our problems are greater than other people's problems when that's not true. So what can we do? I think we can reclaim for ourselves every single day, what is the purpose of our work? Is it to, support a fancy project that is going to make certain people's careers in a certain sector shinier? Or are we really thinking about a larger human project? I keep saying that, you realize, right? I believe we are here on the planet and in this time to learn how to care for others with the same vigorous investment with which we care for and defend ourselves. And everything that's happening in Washington, I think, is a way of trying to dissuade us from taking that purpose to heart. And so for me, that's what I'm reaffirming. And I think, what are the tools I have to do that with? I think, okay, it has to do with this calling that I have claimed for a long time and that I believe has changed my life and that I believe tempers and enlarges our ability to live together in a collectives with others, and that I also know attaches us to the large and mysterious operation of the universe that we are also involved in, and even more than that. And so I think putting a note on your bathroom mirror that says that, in whatever vocabulary that makes sense to you, is a really good starting point. You know, I am large and my purpose is eternal. Empathy and compassion are more important to me than comfort. What are the tools at my disposal to make good on those beliefs? And to do that, I teach and I make space to listen to and be of encouragement and challenge to my students. And ultimately, I believe that I'm doing that so that they can claim their own vocabularies of large purpose that extends beyond the comfort of a job and towards something that it will last.
Tracy, como eu mencionei aqui no início, você não tem apenas livros de poesia, né? Em 2016, você publicou um livro de memórias que se chama Luz Ordinária, e no ano passado, 2024, você lançou o ensaio manifesto para libertar os cativos. Eu queria que você falasse um pouco sobre como a prosa interferiu em suas reflexões sobre a sua história, a dos seus ancestrais e a da diáspora africana.
I was just talking to a poet who might be here, Shelley Boyle, today, about how sometimes there is this knowing that hits you that says, you get to talk about this question in poetry. And other times it's like, you're gonna have to do this in prose. And whenever I get the poetry green light, I think, oh, good, it's my natural language, and I can work with the tools that I lived with for most of my life. And then other times I get the prose signal, and it means I'm gonna have to get down on my knees and learn how to do something that I barely have ever done. And it's gonna take me a long time, and I'm gonna suffer, and I'm going to really learn something that is gonna be exhilarating. Of course, I learned something with poetry, but prose is terrifying to me. But whenever I turn to it, it's because I want to move toward discovery that is unaided by the capacity of poems to leap away from the central question and, by way of metaphor, to move around in a corollary context. And when I choose not to leap away, more and more I realize it has to do with questions grounded in racism, racial difference, and, you know, the intricacies and nuances and deceptions of the American imagination. I didn't call it that when I wrote my first memoir, Ordinary Light, but I knew that in writing about the death of my mother, I also wanted to go back to the time when I, as a personality, was being formed. And my experience of race in suburban California was something that was internalized, spoken about sometimes at home when my parents were telling me, the pain you just felt is not new. Let me tell you about what it felt like for me. But I didn't have a public vocabulary for those things. To Free the Captives was a book that I needed to write because I was realizing in a new way that the American imagination excludes people who descend from histories of enslavement, forced migration, and other forms of violent domination from the capacity for full freedom. Now, I knew that, but I didn't know that I knew how deeply codified it is, not only in the mythology of America, not only in the ways that history is narrated and justified, but even in my own imagination. And what I mean by that is I needed to confront the ways that I have corroborated all of the fallacies of the American imagination. And so, has everyone else in America, and maybe everyone on the globe, because that American imagination has been proliferated through so many forms for so many generations. And so that terrible realization was what I needed to grapple with. And what was really such a blessing was the fact that my ancestors, who I didn't think were going to help me write the book, decided to remind me of all of the things that have worked to preserve the sense of self and purpose and love and possibility in Black life over generations, over centuries. And so to get down on my knees with that question and that reality, and to realize that there were other people there who like I said earlier, are still, even in the afterlife or wherever they are, operating with an investment in this question of liberation. It was, just a really powerful, life-changing kind of discovery. I want to get back to poetry very soon, but there are so many other questions that I need to fumble my way toward wrestling with in language that doesn't come as easily for me. And maybe I choose that when I know that I need to unlearn something, or I need to be forced to acknowledge the problem goes farther than I thought. The problem goes into me and runs through me and operates through me. And somehow those books in prose helped me to claim that. Although those are also questions that run through the poems in these two books that we're also talking about. I remember when I was a student of writing, going to panels and discussions and hearing poets say, well, I had to reinvent myself. I had to find a new form. I had to find a new stance within the question or the material that I have been obsessed with since the beginning of my career. Maybe that's what David Bowie was up to. But I now understand that's part of what art requires us to do. And sometimes it says, you're going to betray this art form that you at first thought you were going to be faithful to but only so that you can work differently in language, which is actually your art form. And that feels like a really interesting opportunity to me.
Bom, então vamos voltar para a poesia. Fiquei sabendo que tem um novo livro que daria para traduzir como Poesia Destemida, Tempos Perigosos. Queria que tu comentasse, né, a partir de quais perspectivas tu parte para esse novo livro, em que pé que está isso, se a gente pode pensar nele no Brasil em breve.
Yes. The book is called Fear Less, Poetry in Perilous Times, and it is another book of prose that is really thinking about much of what I've been saying about poetry as an art form that emboldens us toward listening, toward vulnerability. I also think that though there are many voices in our global culture who try and insist that we're afraid of poetry, that poetry is hard and tricky and we don't know if we need it or like it, poetry is something that helps us defy fear by moving us toward that which we don't understand, or that which we think, as in perspectives and sites of history that we don't like, and reminding us that we have business there. So it's a book that is asking to be useful to this time of division and fear. And it's a book that is arguing for the essential uses of this art form that I believe is one of the most important things on earth. So there's a
a version of the book that is trying to demystify some of the tools and choices that poems employ. And there's a part of the book that talks about American conversations and the ways that community changes with a poem in the room. And yeah, it's coming out in November, and I think I'll get to know it a little bit better when I've talked about it a little bit more.
A gente está se encaminhando para o encerramento dessa conversa. A gente combinou com a Tracy que ela leria mais um poema antes da gente fazer o encerramento oficialmente, então eu queria pedir que ela fizesse isto.
This is a poem called It and Company. And I said earlier, David Bowie is a figure in the book. God is a figure in the book. It is a figure in the book. It is a word that appears many times as a way of trying to tap into what it is that death is like, or what it is that the universe is like, or what it is that sits at the core of our human purpose. And so this is one poem in which I kind of try and acknowledge the ever-present, role of that pronoun, it and company. We are a part of it, not guests. Is it us or what contains us? How can it be anything but an idea, something teetering on the spine of the number I? It is elegant, but coy. It avoids the blunt ends of our fingers as we point. We have gone looking for it everywhere. In Bibles and bandwidth, blooming like a wound from the ocean floor. Still, it resists the matter of false versus real. Unconvinced by our zeal, it is unappeasable. It is like some novels, vast and unreadable. Thank you so much.
E que eu sei que poderíamos passar mais uma hora aqui ouvindo a Tracy, mas infelizmente agora a gente vai ter que se despedir mesmo, então gostaríamos, eu e a Nanni, de agradecer a Tracy, primeiramente, especialmente pela conversa, a generosidade da conversa. O Festival Poesia no Centro, idealizado pela Fernanda Diamant e a Irene de Holanda, ao convite da curadoria, feita pela Rita Palmeira, com tantos detalhes maravilhosos, ao público que veio aqui hoje a acompanhar, as tradutoras de Libras, Gabriela Amaral, Paula Rosa, aos tradutores de inglês para português, o Paulo Silveira, a Beatriz Veloso. Amanhã o festival começa às 11 horas da manhã e...
O festival também acontece, o Poesia no Centro também acontece no Rio de Janeiro. Então, a Tracy sai daqui e segue para conversar com a poeta e jornalista Stephanie Borges, na segunda-feira, dia 19, na Janela Livraria, e a Stephanie, que é a tradutora do Vida em Marte. Eu queria agradecer muitíssimo também ao festival, nas palavras da Adri, queria agradecer muito a Adri pela parceria. Essa foi um grande desafio, mas ao mesmo tempo foi uma delícia preparar essa mediação. A Adri, que é super organizada, me colocou aqui nos eixos. Espero que tenha sido legal.
Ficamos nervosas.
E queria agradecer imensamente a Tracy pelos livros e pela essa conversa de hoje. Muito generosa. Muito obrigada. Obrigada por escrever. É isso.